The Babel narrative and a common language, a historical linguistic approach. The Babel narrative is really quite fascinating from the perspective of historical linguistics, in that it is one of the very few ancient accounts of a people remembering, in a manner of speaking, the history of their language, told of course in a religious context, but remembered nonetheless. To best understand this, and before any type of analysis can begin, a working definition of a few somewhat ambiguous terms must be defined. Perhaps the most important term needing a more concise definition is, quote, the whole world. One must try to put it into context and perspective, the concept of what would have been considered the whole world to the original author or authors of the Babel narrative. The answer is rather simple and straightforward. To a person or people living in what we now call the Middle East several thousand years ago, the whole world would have been just that, a small part of what we now call the Middle East. The concept of a larger world existing beyond the lands these people inhabited and those they were already familiar with just didn't exist. Their entire world was confined to a relatively small area of the Levant. It is quite possible that lands even on the far borders of the Mediterranean were completely unknown to them. The same holds true for the expression, quote, all mankind. Again, this term was confined to only the known people, tribes, and nations encompassing their world. So to quickly summarize, in taking the narrative into historical context, the expressions the whole world and all of mankind must be understood to refer to a very small part and population of what we today call the Middle East. Now that we have a better understanding of just what was meant by these two expressions, we can examine what language or languages would have been spoken in that area several thousand years ago. Was there, or could there indeed have been, a common language spoken by, quote, all mankind? From the point of historical linguistics, this is certainly an intriguing question. The answer is, perhaps surprisingly, yes. However, this yes must also be understood in the context of the aforementioned definitions. It is recognized that almost all languages of what are today the Middle East and parts of North Africa derive from one parent tongue, called Proto-Afro-Asiatic. This proto-language, due to several factors, including the migration and isolation of people from each other over time, split off into several dialects, one of which was called Proto-Semitic, the parent tongue of all Semitic languages. The general consensus seems to be that Proto-Semitic had its ultimate origins in Arabia, Mesopotamia, or perhaps even Africa, and spread westward. The time frame for this split is still somewhat debated, and there's a couple of different theories. Proto-Semitic subsequently splintered off and developed into the various Semitic languages found in the ancient Middle East. This again was due to several factors, including the migration of peoples and the general isolation of these peoples from one another over time. It is important to note that this process was not immediate. It took several hundred years for Proto-Semitic to develop into multiple separate languages. It should also be noted that in ancient times, there were quite a few Semitic languages. It was a good-sized language family, but unfortunately only a small handful of these have survived into modern times. Turning back to the Babel narrative and taking into context the concept of the whole world, as we just discussed earlier, it is quite reasonable to conclude that the common language referred to in the Babel narrative as, quote, spoken by all mankind was, in fact, what we know today as Proto-Semitic. What is fascinating is that even back then, it was recognized that there must have been at one time some parent language, some common tongue for the various languages people encountered in their world. The somewhat mutual intelligibility between these languages, or at the very least the similarity in cognate vocabulary, surely must have been recognized. This concept of recognizing the similarity in current languages, cognate words, core grammatical words, things like pronouns, numbers, etc., and postulating that they all must have derived from some common parent tongue seems to have been preserved in the oral tradition of these people via the Babel narrative. And this is actually something that's quite remarkable. To these people, however, the reasons for the various related languages they encountered would not have been known or understood. They would have no concept of the hows and whys of the splintering off of the parent tongue Proto-Semitic. They just knew that there are now several distinct languages, and the similarities between them seem to point to one parent language at one time. So how did they account for this confounding of languages? Well, as with many things not clearly understood by ancient man, the reasons were usually attributed to a deity, some act of God, if you will. Such must have been the case here as well. The reasons for the confounding of these languages was not understood and thus attributed to an act of God. To these people, this somewhat strange act of God must have begged the question, why would God have done such a thing? I would argue that the tower itself is more of a literary device than anything. It is pure allegory or metaphor, perhaps the intentional creation of a backstory, if you will, to explain the reason for the current situation and to have a vehicle by which to attribute the event as an act of God. It is likely that the tower itself was modeled after the ziggurats, common in Babylonia, so not something just out of the blue or seemingly far-fetched. In any event, the tower itself may be considered as just a metaphor for man wanting to connect to or become closer to God. I don't believe it was ever something literal or concrete, that is, an actual physical structure, despite what some TV shows might like you to kind of believe. Here was a story that was easy to understand and relate to. As a result of an adverse action or deed perpetrated by mankind as a united intention to try and become like God, God put an end to it by confounding man's languages and making communication between people difficult, if not impossible, so that they would not be able to complete their intended task. It seems that this diversity in languages was seen as something instantaneous and probably quite miraculous and mysterious. Again, there was no concept of languages changing and diverging very slowly over long periods of time. People just knew that at one time there was one language spoken by everyone, and now there were several. Let's examine a few facts which I suspect are typically glossed over by most people. It is important to note that while the Babel account does indicate a common original language, it does not claim that said language was Hebrew, as many people kind of think or assume. I think it's assumed to be Hebrew due to the fact that Hebrew is the sacerdotal language of Judaism. For Jews, this was like the language of God, so in a sense, it would make sense to them that this original language was their own language, Hebrew. There was also zero indication in the narrative that God necessarily used a supernatural process in the confounding of the languages. The narrative is completely silent in this matter. Further, and perhaps most importantly, though most people interpret and assume it as such, the account does not claim that this diversification of languages was an immediate event. This is perhaps the most common concept that is read, or perhaps I should say misread, into the text. There's no reason not to think that a very natural process in language development took place here. It seems that people felt this was an important part of their tradition and culture, and thus should be remembered. But given that only an oral tradition existed, how does one get people to remember an important story and not forget it in a few generations? In many ancient cultures, the best way to tell such a story and have it remembered is in a religious context. It's much less likely to be forgotten over generations because it becomes part of both the cultural and, more so, religious traditions of the people. Thus, one might imagine the Babel narrative was woven, a combining of history, such as it was understood back then, and religion into a powerful story with a specific message. The Babel narrative is also interesting in that it relates that these original speakers came from the East. This is generally regarded as the migration route of Proto-Semitic, that is, the original Sprachgebiet, language area, was to the east of what is now Israel and the surrounding countries and moved westward. If, however, the religious context is extracted for a moment, the result is a fairly accurate historical account of what happened. Speakers of Proto-Semitic migrated toward the west, and as they migrated and became isolated nations or groups, etc., their languages eventually splintered off into what would have been at first just dialects of Proto-Semitic, but over time, separate but a very closely related group of languages, so a confounding of languages from one parent tongue. When the religious context is added back in, the notion commonly assumed is that God used the confounding of languages to scatter the people. However, I think it may be strongly argued that God scattered the people to cause a confusion of languages. Indeed, it seems that Babel may have served as the focus point, or the ground zero, if you will, for this confusion of languages to start. We then see where God scatters the people. No mention that the languages were confounded before he scattered them, which seems to indicate that this is, in fact, the means by which the languages became confounded. An interesting take on the narrative, as it fits more closely with what actually happened historically. So, the Babel narrative from the viewpoint of historical linguistics. A fascinating account, as it is only one of very few stories worldwide where the history of a people's language is remembered. As a closing remark and sort of a complete aside, the Babel narrative has absolutely zero to do with the modern concept of tongues. Modern tongues are hardly some sort of, quote, reversal of Babel, as some Christian groups might like to think. The concept here is that, you have Babel, one language, confounded into many, and then we have tongues, many languages today, reversed into, one heavenly language. The problem with this idea, of course, is that modern tongues are an entirely self-created phenomenon. By the very nature of how modern tongues are constructed and produced, no two people will ever have the same tongue, ever. There are as many tongues as there are speakers of tongues. Indeed, there are more tongues than there are currently languages in the entire world, which is kind of hardly a reversal of Babel. So anyways, that's it. Thanks for listening, and I do look forward to your comments.